The Penre Papers, the second level of learning. Exopolitics Paper Number 3, The Great Galactic Wars by Penre, Friday, July 20, 2012, http://wespenre.com. Part 1. 1. Queendom and Kingdoms in Orion. 900 light-years from Earth, orbiting a star system of a hot blue star in the belt of Orion, a steaming planet was born. This planet was a beautiful jungle-like world. It was allegedly one in a series of planets and star systems which were seeded first, after the goddess had created this universe and it had cooled off enough for life to exist. A team of builders were appointed, and the show began in this young universe, billions upon billions of years ago. After the builders had panspermed the first series of planets, some time passed, and the builders came back and continued the seeding of this particular jungle planet, being the beginning of a rich animal life which eventually would, together with the fauna, develop into a full-grown ecosystem. Then was the time to create a more advanced, intelligent life form, and the first reptilian race in this universe was born. This new universe was a universe of free will, an experiment in its own right to see how living entities could survive in a harsher environment and still develop love, compassion, and empathy and learn the ways of the goddess. And this jungle world was indeed a harsh environment to survive in. The experiment started with this ancient reptilian race, whom have been called the Ancient Ones in esoteric circles here on Earth, who was the first to prove if they could do it. This particular reptilian species was born with the fire of the mother inserted into their black, reptilian bodies. Although they had a close connection to the goddess, because this was how they were designed, they were still required to go through evolution. Pure survival required of them to develop both brilliance and strong, enduring bodies to be able to master the environment they were born into. In the ancient beginnings, these ruthless, ferocious reptiles had scales covering their bodies for protection, and they could even fly, having huge wings on their backs. With time they learned how to conquer the world they were born into. They started building early civilizations which became more and more advanced, and although civil wars and conflicts were common in the beginning, they eventually managed to explore other planets in their own solar system. As they evolved, their scales disappeared and over the generations they started looking more and more humanoid, but still with certain remaining reptilian features. With time their bodies became long and slender, contrary to the SIRIUS, who are short and stocky, and their bodies were, and still are black. These days the women have a pinched waist, similar to the bee, and you can see this feature in some human women as well. In Swedish, we call it getting midja or wasp waist. However, when we're speaking of the Aryans, their waistline is very thin, much thinner than in any human female. In the early days, the reptilians had more of a triangular head, but it eventually became more rounded in males, albeit, still remaining somewhat triangular in females. They had little, or no body hair, and most of them, even the females, did not have hair on their heads, either. Their eyes were large and piercing. According to what I read or hear, these days they are actually, believe it or not, quite gorgeous looking. The saying goes that hardly any male in the universe can resist an Aryan female. The males have broader chests, but just like the females they have narrow waists. Their legs are thicker and their buttocks bigger, showing typical male features. Their faces, although rounded, have a squarer chin than the females, who in general have a softer, more feminine look to them. The mouths of both males and the females are large, and when they are closed, they blend in with the rest of the face and almost seem invisible. Their teeth, however, females and males alike, are still sharp and quite useful after billions of years of evolution. The females, in the early days, also possessed a deadly venom, which she could use in battle by spitting quite a long distance, and whomever got hit either died or was paralyzed. It seems like she lost her abilities to do this a long time ago. Their society became very female-oriented with time as the species developed, and life in Orion revolved around the Orion Queen. The females did the hard work and the male's rule was to mate with the queen and protect her from enemies and invaders. On the battlefield it was usually the males who dominated, although the females were excellent warriors in their own right, but at home it was the female who dominated daily life in the Aryan society, the male was the hunter and the warrior. Early on, the male warriors started conquering neighboring territories and took them over. These territories were then ruled by the males who conquered them, and they became known as the Black Nekh Kings, or just the Black Kings. They ruled their kingdoms with an iron fist. However, in the center of the Aryan world, the queen remained the ruler and was the center of attention. So in that sense, the Aryan world was divided between the kings and the queen. Still, when came to serious matters, the kings always obeyed the queen's will, so in that sense, the queen was in charge. So it seems like the separation between males and females have been an issue ever since the beginning of time. This subject is also described very well and in details on the Ages of Ura website. Their society became very female-oriented with time as the species developed, and life in Orion revolved around the Orion queen. The females did the hard work and the male's rule was to mate with the queen and protect her from enemies and invaders. On the battlefield it was usually the males who dominated, although the females were excellent warriors in their own right, but at home it was the female who dominated daily life in the Aryan society, the male was the hunter and the warrior. Early on, the male warriors started conquering neighboring territories and took them over. These territories were then ruled by the males who conquered them, and they became known as the Black Nekh Kings, or just the Black Kings. They ruled their kingdoms with an iron fist. However, in the center of the Aryan world, the queen remained the ruler and was the center of attention. So in that sense, the Aryan world was divided between the kings and the queen. Still, when came to serious matters, the kings always obeyed the queen's will, so in that sense, the queen was in charge. So it seems like the separation between males and females have been an issue ever since the beginning of time. This subject is also described very well and in details on the Ages of Ura website. 2. The First Great Galactic War. As time went by, the Aryans became more peaceful and stopped engaging themselves in wars between each other and instead started developing technology under one flag. The kingdoms merged into one kingdom under one king. The weapon industry was an important one, but they also engaged in all other sciences and technologies thinkable and eventually became very high-tech. The male Nekh warriors figured out how to reach out in space and explore the neighbor worlds, but soon also figured out how to do interstellar space travel. They started visiting other star systems which had developed life, just like themselves, but most of these worlds were not nearly as developed as those of Orion. Hence, in the beginning there was no resistance when the Aryans came. The inhabitants of these younger worlds welcomed them with open arms, in very peaceful manners. They simply didn't know better, as they had apparently not developed warlike behavior. The Nekh king and his warriors were surprised to meet this kind of hospitality, but took advantage of it. They started establishing bases on these worlds and soon came to rule them under kings of their own species. But all these conquered worlds answered to the Nekh king who sat on the throne of the Aryan Empire on the home planet. The conquest continued, and the Aryan Empire expanded without much resistance. However, with time other star races in the galaxy had developed as well, and suddenly the Aryan warriors encountered worlds where the inhabitants could defend themselves. Some of them still stood no chance against the ferocious Nekh warriors, and these worlds, too, were conquered and put under Orion jurisdiction. But not all battles were won. Some of the star beings on planets the Aryans approached were at least as ferocious as themselves and the reptilians started losing some of these battles and had to retreat. When this had happened a few times, and many Aryans had died in battle, they stopped their conquest for a while to think things over. That was the end of the First Great Galactic War, long before the Sirian star race even existed. 3. The Second Great Galactic War. The Orion Nekh king was pondering what to do. Then he realized that in the distant past, females had been even better warriors than the males, so the king decided to bring the females into the war, to fight side by side with the males. And so they started another galactic war in an effort to expand the empire. This time they were much more successful. The females were not only incredible warriors, who never backed off, always fighting to the bitter end, if necessary, they also had a deadly weapon that the males didn't have: their venom. They could spit the enemies in their eyes, bite them, scratch them with their claw-like nails, or spit on the blades of their swords of knives, and when poking the enemy, if they didn't die from the poke, they died from the poison. The thing is that the venom that was produced could paralyze or kill the enemy in almost an instant. This made the Aryan females feared in the entire sector of the galaxy, among the worlds to which the rumor had spread. This way, a lot of new worlds and star systems were conquered and merged into the Orion Empire, which grew fast and steadily. Albeit, there was also great resistance on some worlds, and not all battles were won, but it looks like most of them were, something that inspired the Aryans to continue their conquest of the galaxy. The female warriors were indeed the legendary Amazon warriors, and legend says that Bellatrix in Orion is the Amazon star. When a world at war with the Aryans had to negotiate, their leaders rather speak to a male diplomat than a female, because they feared their fury. Once a world was conquered, a king was still sat on the throne, but females protected him and the planet. They were seldom heavily armed, all they needed were spears, swords, knives, and perhaps arrow and bow, just like the artist suggests. Isn't that how we humans depict an Amazon warrior? We picture them as tall, perhaps giant women, beautiful but deadly, and this was how the early female Bellatrix warriors were. The reptilian Aryan race, contrary to the SIRIUS, are tall, probably taller than humans, and could perhaps be viewed as giants in our eyes. The conquest continued and the Orion Empire grew in size to become the largest empire in the 9th sector of the galaxy. With hundreds upon hundreds of star systems under the belt, the Aryans eventually settled down and stopped conquering, at least in the capacity that they had in the past. The Second Great Galactic War was over, and this time the success was complete. The Aryans were very pleased. 4. From Kingdom to Queendom. Here on Earth we have a saying that behind every successful man there is a woman. We joke about it, but in many cases, this is correct. Women in our society have been very suppressed, as we know, and many of them know that they are often smarter than men in many ways. They have more intuition, are more connected with what we call the 96% universe, can see bigger pictures, and make decisions that show to bear fruit over a longer period of time. Hence, because women, when they understand that the man's ego will be hurt if they make the decisions, they often still do, but in a more subtle way. They understand how the man thinks and can be master manipulators so that they get their ways, thinking that it was the man's decision. Thus, his ego is not hurt. I am not suggesting that women are more manipulative than men, but in a suppressed state, they have developed these skills and are using them, often successfully. The same principle worked in Orion. In the Empire, the female was never suppressed like she is here, and was actually the administrator of the Empire even when the kings sat on the thrones of the worlds, but the kings had the real power during, and after, the Great Galactic Wars. At least, that's what they believed. However, just like here on Earth, the kings liked to believe they were the smarter ones, but were manipulated both by the queen and her administrators. They themselves never saw it coming because their egos prevented them from seeing it, but in the eyes of the Aryan people, the queen and her administrators became more and more respected and the ones the people listened to. The queen still sat on the throne as the head of the females, but in the eyes of the kings, she was more decorative than powerful. This was a big mistake, as would show. The Orion Queen had planned the coup in the smallest details. One night, the lead king of the Orion Empire was killed by the Queen's female elite warriors. The Queen announced to the king's court that there was an ongoing coup, an attempt to take over the empire from within. She blamed the coup on males trying to take over when the king was murdered, but assured the empire that she, the Queen of Orion, would help them through these difficult times and would be the new, temporary leader of the empire until the rebels had all been found and assassinated. Then the power would go back to the males, she said, and a new king would be selected. Many protested, especially in the male cabinet, but the queen held her position. However, in the next few weeks, the same males who had protested mysteriously disappeared and were later found dead. So were the heirs of the king. Key people of his bloodline were conveniently assassinated and the empire was in shock and confusion. Still, the queen reassured them that the traitors would be found and taken care of. But this was just the beginning. On the other worlds, which had been conquered by the Aryans, the kings, one by one, were murdered, and the planets were taken over by female administrators. The original inhabitants of these Aryan colonies saw this as an opportunity to rebel, thinking that they had spotted a weakness in the kingdom of Orion now when the kings could no longer defend their domains. Big mistake. The Aryan females were far more ferocious than their male part, and all rebellion was quickly handled in its cradle and order was re-established, more or less immediately. Before the males had had the chance to really come to terms with what was happening, the queen and her warriors had already taken over, not only the home planet in Orion's belt, but also the colonies. The kingdom of Orion had now become the queendom of Orion. The females had regained the power over the empire. 5. The Third Great Galactic War. Once the females had taken back the power in Orion, things started progressing quickly. If star races thought that the Orion kings were ruthless conquerors, they hadn't seen anything yet. Now things had changed to the opposite, and the royal Nekh and Makh warriors now served the queen. But the most fearless ones were still the Amazon warriors from Bellatrix. Together, they conquered worlds, not only in their own sector of the galaxy, but in other sectors as well as other galaxies. The triumph was big, because the queen realized that her empire was unbreakable. Who would even think of attack her now? The rumors of the fury of the queen and her Amazons, Nekh and Makh warriors spread like wildfire through the universe, and when a star race knew they were approaching, many laid down their weapons and surrendered. The Aryans, when spoken about on other worlds, were often called the SSS, due to their hissing sound when they talked, just like serpents. Although, the queen on the home world was called Nekht, where T stood for queen, one of her many titles became SSSSSS, both at home and on other worlds. In Orion, if you were a person of rank, you doubled your name, in this case from SSS to SSSSSS. The empire itself throughout the 9th sector became known as An, which means the highest or heaven, the Orion Empire. Interesting, then, how the Syrian overlords later on started using Aryan, feminine names as names of their kings and royalty. The most prominent king of Sirius during the Sumerian times, and even long before and after, called himself An, adopted by the Sumerian languages, and he was Anu in Akkadian. 6. Peace in Orion. After perhaps millions of years of conquest, the Aryans eventually laid down their weapons. At least they did no longer offensively attack other star races, and now only used violence if they had to defend themselves against invader forces. And then only as the last result. The queen became tired of war and started realizing that killing is indeed a double-edged sword, where those who kill will later be killed in some revengeful situation, or maybe because if your energies are focused on war and killing, those are the energies you attract. And not only that. At some point, the queen and her people became much more spiritually oriented, perhaps thanks to her Makh scientists, who may at one point have discovered that the universe indeed is feminine in nature. As the Aryan soul group evolved, they started seeing things differently, and they realized that they all were part of the Great Spirit, the creation of the Mother Goddess. And so, the religion of the Mother Goddess was eventually reaching a higher peak of development, where the queen, allegedly due to her basic fire, could connect with the Khaa and act as a medium for the goddess energy. People probably immediately let the word channeler come to mind, but it was apparently much more than that. The queen had a direct telepathic connection with the goddess, and by many both on the home planet and elsewhere in the empire and beyond she became thought of as the goddess manifest. This, of course, couldn't have happened overnight, from her star race being ferocious conquerors to being accepted as the main spiritual group in this sector of the universe. It was a transition which probably took thousands, if not millions of years. Today, the Orion Queen is still the Queen of the Stars, but her empire is now a peaceful one, and star races from near and far come to Orion to trade or ask for advice. Star races, instead of being forced into the empire, are now asking for membership, or are asked to join if they see fit and ready. 7. The Aryan founders, the Tree of Life and the Elixir of the Gods. The Aryans were, as we know, a highly technological society, and with time they became founders. They learned how to seed planets with life. Hence, instead of conquering other worlds, they now went out and did it the way that was expected from a higher evolved race. Although the universe was still relatively young, we are talking about billions of years ago, there were already lots of beings and star races who had evolved outside the Aryan Empire to become life designers at their own merit. However, there was an abundance of empty star systems which were ready to be panspermed. So the Orions lined up with creator gods from other star systems outside the Empire and even from other universes to seed new planets all around the Milky Way and beyond. Once these new planets had developed their fauna and flora, most of them were then being inhabited by their own intelligent race, who had the potentials to eventually reach the stars. Once these new races were ready, they either applied for membership in the Aryan Empire, or were asked if they wanted to join. Most of them did, and do, while a few decided to go their own way, and some of these created their own empires eventually. There should be noted here that there is channeled material, and the same thing can be read in Anton Park's work and others, where it is stated that the Aryan Empire is known as a religious cult in the universe, where the Aryans worship a mother goddess, and the Orion Queen has put herself as the emissary of the goddess. This means that, if you subscribe to this cult, you can't pray or talk to the mother goddess without first going through the queen. If this would be true, the Orion Empire is nothing but a religious dictatorship, similar to the Catholic Church on earth, where the Pope has put himself between the people and the Creator, as the emissary to God. Although, I have reasons to believe that this is not the case, even if it may seem so to some readers. Again, I am trusting anonymous sources, whom I respect and have learned to trust. Still, I ask the readers to use their own judgment and discernment and do their own research where possible and doubt what I'm saying here if it doesn't ring true. I have no way at this time to prove my statements, other than presenting my experience and the knowledge I have gained. However, this is my knowledge, so each person needs to use their own intuition and imagination sometimes in order to connect the dots. The MAKH scientists, who were the Queen's personal scientists, were not only seeding planets and developing skills to create bodies from scratch, they also dedicated themselves to, among other things, finding a way to extend the life expectancy of a biological being. In the Bible this is referred to as the Tree of Life. It apparently took them 1,000,000 years, the way we count time, to develop an elixir which could extend life considerably. There were a few milestones on the way, where the scientists managed to extend the life cycle of an individual gradually, but no notable successes could be measured until after about 1,000,000 of years' worth of research. Eventually, they could present the very life elixir which became the Tree of Life, and it became known as the Esma. The Queen and her race are cold-blooded because they are reptilians, but the MAKH scientists had found a way to develop extracts based on warm blood nutrients. This liquid worked as an enhancer of the Queen's metabolism and added to a being's physical strength and vitality. It also had showed to extend the life of the Queen considerably, so basically, while looking for a way to extend the life of biological bodies, the solution came when looking into something totally different, a nutrient for the Queen. Amazingly enough, the ESMA showed to extend the Queen's lifespan with up to perhaps millions of years, or more. Being part of the physical universe, or the 4%, everything ages and declines, even so the bodies of the Orion Queen. So in simple terms, what the MAKH scientists did was to take the KHAA essence and apply it to bodies in the physical universe. This liquid became known as Soma, from Esma, where S is causative, and Ma means mother in Aryan, the elixir of the gods or the fountain of youth. The Queen noticed that by taking this elixir, her aging halted considerably, and not only that she stayed young, both at heart and in spirit. So, the MAKH scientists continued their research along these lines and eventually found a way to reanimate a body. If a body died, and it was taken care of within a reasonable time afterwards, it could be reanimated and brought back to life. This was only possible, of course, if the body was still in a reasonable shape. This is also why the Egyptian pharaohs were mummified. They thought they could be revived at a later time. In addition, they also learned how to regenerate bodies by taking cells from living beings and restore body parts in case of an injury or decay. Due to all this research, bodies could now be kept intact, almost forever, and death more or less became something that could be referred to in the history books. Before this elixir was totally developed, the queen died of old age on occasion, and had to start anew in a new body, similar to how the Dalai Lama does it here on Earth, where the legend says that the Dalai Lama is reincarnating in a new body and just continues his mission. The new Dalai Lama has to be found, and there are certain body marks and other signs which tell the Lamas of the East how to find him. Once he's found, they teach him to remember who he really is, and he can re-establish himself as the new Dalai Lama. Transferred to our Orion story, the queen would take a new body within the same bloodline as the old one and continue from there. This could at times be quite cumbersome, and with this new elixir, this problem became more or less obsolete. This liquid was also shared with other, trusted members of the Aryan Empire and became the elixir of the gods, that the Syrians and others fought over while here on Earth. We need to keep in mind, though, that the body of those star races are of a lighter density than those of humans, and thus live longer by default, and star beings in general, who are not trapped like we are, can normally, once they've reached a certain stage of development, choose whether they want to keep a purely physical body or not. Some think it's convenient, while others find it being an obstacle, so it varies. It is my understanding that the Orion Queen is indeed still keeping her body as a vessel to bring in the KHAA energies. Of course, over time the Aryan scientists learned how to clone whole bodies as well, and they were not the only ones who knew how to do that. It is, as we've discussed earlier, a common way for beings to jump from one body to the next, something the Syrians do all the time, and this technology is not isolated to the Aryan Empire. We can read extensively about it in Anton Park's chronicles as well as elsewhere in metaphysical literature. But due to the connection the Queen allegedly has established with the KHAA, one would presume she wants to keep her originally body as intact as possible and not degenerate it if she can avoid it.